Good afternoon. My name is JJ Spoon, and I'm Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of the Center for European Studies at Pitt. For today's conversation on Europe, we will be discussing the Finnish education model and what we can learn from it. Today's conversation is sponsored by the European Studies Center and the University Center for International Studies here at the University of Pittsburgh. Our co-sponsors are the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence at Florida International University and the European Union Center at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Thank you to my colleague Iris Atievich for her help in organizing today's event. So just to start us off with a bit of background, Finland, a Nordic country roughly the size of Germany and with a population the size of Denmark, has consistently ranked above the OECD average in international assessment exams. It has taken a very different approach to education. Some of the hallmarks of the Finnish model include school not starting until age 7, and that there are only 9 years of compulsory education. School days are shorter, and there is more recess and free time, and less work outside of school typically. There are few standardized tests. The focus both within schools and across the system is on collaboration and cooperation and not competition. All teachers are required to have a master's degree, and teaching programs are among the most rigorous and selective professional schools in the country. The Finnish model has generated a great deal of interest among practitioners and academics around the world, and has led American Fulbright winner and author William Doyle to remark, quote, "I have seen the school of tomorrow. It is here today in Finland," unquote. But can the Finnish model transfer to other settings? What are the limitations? And how did Finland develop this unique education model, and why has it been so successful? To answer these and other questions, we turn to our panel of experts that I'm joined by today, both here in Pittsburgh and virtually. Our participants today include my colleague Cassie Quigley, who is here with me in Pittsburgh. She is an associate professor of science education in the Department of Instruction and Learning at the School of Education at the University of Pittsburgh. She received her doctorate in curriculum and instruction at Indiana University, and previously she taught high school biology and physics, where she often witnessed students who were disengaged from science. Because of this experience, her research now focuses on broadening the ideas of and participation in science so that all students feel connected to the subject. Currently, she works with in-service teachers on expanding their current pedagogical practices to include equitable approaches. Professor Quigley is also working on how the practices used in Finnish nature schools can be translated into other settings, something that we'll talk about later in today's discussion. And I am joined by two colleagues in Finland. So welcome first to Yuri Lyndon, who is a senior lecturer of higher education in the Faculty of Education and Culture at the University of Tampere. He focuses on faculty development programs and supporting the professional development of academic staff, both at Tampere and in international contexts, which have included Thailand, Brazil, and Palestine. His research interests have focused on curriculum and higher education, generational perspectives to student engagement and academic work, and understanding teachers' work and its political and cultural connections in all levels of schooling in Finland. He previously worked in different positions in primary education for nearly 15 years, including as a teacher. So welcome, Yuri. And I'm also joined by Nelly Bjergsen, who is the head of the innovation unit at the Finnish National Agency for Education. She holds a Master's of Education from the University of Helsinki and has worked at the Finnish National Agency for Education for the past 7 years. Her responsibilities have included leading as head of unit the development of pre-primary and basic education, professional development of educational personnel, and in addition, early childhood education and care. She has had a long career in education at school and district levels as a teacher, vice principal, and principal. Mrs. Rautinen has been a keynote speaker and panelist in over 25 countries and 5 continents at various international conventions. She is a member of the OECD Education 2030 Working Group and a member of the OECD Group High Performing Systems for Tomorrow. So welcome to all of our colleagues. So I thought I would start us out. I gave in the introduction a bit of an overview of some of the characteristics of the Finnish system, but I thought we could dive into that a little bit more in terms of some of the characteristics, but also how the Finnish education model compares to others in Europe, and what are some of the differences and what makes it unique. So Nelly, would you like to start us off?
Yes, thank you. Pleasure to be here. And basically, I guess we all have our past and our present and the future in education. And when we talk about similarities at the European level, we have to look at the Nordic countries, and our societies are very similar. And so we have a lot in common also in our education systems. Um, we also have a neighbor country, Estonia, that has really developed their system during the past few years, and their learning outcomes have really risen from what they were in the past. And when you discuss with your Estonian colleagues, they tell us that they learned from us, but they were also able to implement their own system in a new way. So I highly recognize Estonia as one of the good examples where they have learned and then implemented new education system in their own country.
Yuri or Cassie, would you like to, Cassie, if you'd like to?
Sure, yeah. Obviously, I don't have as much experience in terms of comparing Finnish schools to other European schools, but I did, I spent a sabbatical in Spain and my children were in Spanish public schools, and so I was able to sort of view as a parent some of the differences and similarities, I think, in terms of compulsory education and also infusement of practices like foreign language, so foreign language beginning there at age, in preschool at age 3 or 4. Their preschool system seems similar to some of the Finnish models in terms of very play-based, a lot of outdoor activities, and that continues through secondary school. And of course, there's a little bit of the culture of Spain with the siesta in the afternoon, which I think provides a sense of structure around your day in terms of taking care of the whole self as well.
Yuri, would you like to add to?
Well, just I think this is quite obvious. Well, you probably know this already, but I think one of the kind of a typical feature in Finland is that basically all schools are public, and they are, I would say, even today, kind of reasonable. There's quite stable, reasonable funding. So I think that's one kind of a unique feature that previously, in previous years, that has been something that I think we have been quite proud of, that there are no big differences between schools, whether they are in urban areas or in rural areas. But that at the same time we have to kind of admit that that's one thing which is really something that we really need to work on today. It seems that it's not going in very good direction, but I would still say that politicians they seem to be kind of pay quite a lot of attention to this thing. Pretty much both right and left-wing parties are interested in maintaining or trying to keep all schools pretty much in the similar position.
Yeah, I'm curious if I could ask a follow-up question about that. That was something, of course, that is often pointed to as one of the biggest challenges with U.S. schools. And then so I'm curious if on your funding model. So in the U.S., we fund our public schools based on the property taxes. So then if your house is more expensive, you pay more taxes, so your school gets more money. And conversely, if you live in a lower income area, less taxes going to schools. That isn't totally true across the nation, but as an example, so I'm just curious how are schools funded, and how does that differ?
Perhaps Anneli, would you like to comment on this?
Yes, equity is such an important value for us, so we make sure that the taxpayers' money goes to everyone, really. So we have one school for all, and education is free at all levels. And it's partly paid or covered by the taxpayers' money through the government. And then the municipal authorities also have to add their municipal taxpayers' money in order to fulfill the needs of each school. But that way, because the funding is pretty equal, it also ensures that everyone is kind of giving the same possibilities to run schools in each municipality. And this is one of the basic issues, like Yuri was saying.
Yeah, and in the U.S., as Cassie was saying, this is, has historically been a challenge because of the funding model. Mm-hmm. And we see major differences in all aspects of education based often on sort of the socioeconomic differences in different areas. And that's one of the big challenges for sure. I wonder if we could maybe go back a little bit and talk. I know that obviously the Finnish education system was not always as it is today, both in terms of sort of levels of achievement, but also just in terms of processes and sort of what was happening in the schools. And so I wonder perhaps, Nelly, if you want perhaps to start us off, maybe describing a little bit kind of where 20, 30 years ago, what schools in Finland looked like, what education looked like, and sort of where this interest in kind of this real, innovative reform came from.
Well, if we look at Finland 100 years ago, it was the poorest country in Europe. So things have really changed since then. And one of the wisest decisions made was to have everyone equal access to education. And the first schools were run by the Lutheran Church, and people had to know how to read in order to get married. So this was a good catcher for everyone. And we still score very high in literacy skills in Pisa, for example. But I think the most important decision making by the politicians was made in the late 60s, early 70s, when we established a comprehensive school, which really guaranteed everyone a 9-year basic education. And despite where about in the country, or from what kind of social economic background you come from what racial or religious background you come from, you're guaranteed to have same quality education. And along with that came a very strong emphasis on building a national curriculum that kind of enabled also equal opportunities for every teacher to follow up with the kind of values and pedagogical visions and features. And I think we had some inspectors, I should say, in schools, but we stopped having inspection in schools in the early 80s. So that also has built us a lot of trust, so that we know that we have high quality teacher education. In 1979, also the class teachers' education became master level. And that way, building on good education for the teachers, trusting them, and also building sort of like trust within the society to the education system has really taken us far. And I think those are the basic issues that wise decision makers really made at that point. And I think from then on, I should also say that we haven't gone to national assessments, so to speak. We've trusted that good national curriculum carries excellent work, and so far it has. The only national examination we have after the 3 years of upper secondary education, which will then is a base sort of to apply for the university. And one feature that I have to mention is that in our education system, we don't have any dead ends. So after the basic education, if you choose to take your steps into the vocational education and training, you can still go to the university. So there are two very good options after the 9 years of basic education to choose upper secondary education or vocational education. You can still become doctorate in science, or, so back to the equality and trust.
Here, I wonder if you could maybe talk a bit about, or sort of paint a bit of a picture of, before these, kind of the reforms with the national curriculum and sort of the changes that developed in the classrooms themselves. Sort of what did the classroom look like, right? How was education, right? How were things being taught? Just to kind of give a sense of, how far we've come in Finland.
Uh, you mean like in the history sense, or?
Yeah, exactly. So how would, the sort of the day look different, or how would information be conveyed? I assume obviously in a much more traditional, teacher sits at the front of the room, reads, students write, bring it, rote memorization, that sort of a thing. If that's correct. And then kind of how has that changed in sort of more recent, what we see now in the classroom?
Yeah, thanks. If I just very briefly go a little bit back to the history, like in the mid 1850s or somewhere around that, when Finland was just when it was just being built up as a nation state before the independence, and at that point the founding fathers, they had a very sort of a strong vision where public schooling and public education, kind of the idea of education for all, that was heavily connected to the whole idea of nation state. And I guess those are the sort of also the roots of this kind of the political idea of why public schooling is that important. It kind of the more there was kind of the idea of Finland as a nation, the more there was also kind of an idea of public schooling, and I guess I'm not an expert in describing the kind of what the schools actually look like at the point, but somehow I feel that it's that it has been a very sort of a traditional, even the the Second World War era, the schools in Finland, they were quite traditional, and classroom settings, they were very sort of traditional, but for some reason, from the sociological perspective, I think the post-war generations, they somehow sort of felt very heavily that the economic and the kind of the economic rise which was very rapid in Finland after 1950s, 1960s, that was a very rapid economic growth. And I think that part of that growth was very much sort of related to education in all levels. And I think the generations, at that time, they felt that education has been something which kind of have opened up their possibilities to be educated, and also that has been the story or the narrative that they have also given to their children. And I think that even there, I don't think there were such before what Anneli also mentioned before that 1970s. Late 1960s, I think the classrooms were very traditional, but the whole trust on the institution and teachers in general, I think that was a very sort of a solid foundation for the whole kind of all levels of education to develop.
Mm-hmm. So something that kind of follows from what both of you said, and Cassie, feel free to jump in as well, is, and I know there's obviously lots of discussion among educators and those who work in higher education as well about sort of what is the purpose of school, right, more generally. And I think that, and I know, Nelly, you've spoken a bit about this as well in the past, but this, just thinking about what the purpose is, and how that then develops what the curriculum looks like, and what the actual focus is as well. So, Nelly, since I know I've spoken about this before, if you want to start us off, and I'll give the others a chance to think a bit about it.
This is a very good question, and I think it's important that when we think about the purpose of school, we think both it from the individual perspective and also from the society's perspective. And basically, I think it's the purpose is to give everyone a chance to learn and reach his or her potential in life, which means that sort of everyone has a chance to have a good life despite what the background of a child is. But at the same time, I think we have to talk about all of us as learners. So talk about lifelong learning. Basic education provides a lot of skills also how to learn. So you have to learn how to learn, and then you can also build your life on that. I think the world is changing very rapidly now, and we have to make sure that education provides the skills that are needed today and also tomorrow. So a lot of today's school consists of problem solving, real life issues, problem solving, and to look at phenomena that exist and give tools for children and young people to really solve these very, very complex problems. In our curriculum, we state that the core of our curriculum is to grow as a human being and as a citizen. So I think that pretty much captures also my personal idea of what is important in learning, whatever that means for an individual student. And we've come to appreciate more like student-centered learning instead of teacher-centered learning, and student-centered also approach in a way that learning is really in connection with others. So sort of like a social constructivist way of learning. That's just some thoughts to begin with.
Great, no,
Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you. No, I think I mean, my own personal philosophy on why we have education is very similar. So in my own teaching, I train future science teachers. And so the work that I do is very in line with what Nelly just mentioned, which is focusing on real world relevant problem solving. And including in that is how that students can work together collaboratively to solve those problems. So we look at, a lot of the 21st century skills that we're hoping students will get at the end of their K-12 experience, which include creativity, communication, collaboration, and critical thinking. And what's interesting is I do spend a lot of time in public sector, thinking about with employers, who are the students, who would you like to hire? And those are the things I often talk about, right? It's not that they don't think content knowledge is important, but a lot of employers feel like that content knowledge can be, learned at a later stage, and it also changes so rapidly. But I think in the US, we still see a big disconnect there. So the challenge for me as a teacher educator here in the US is often modeling those practices within my classroom, but then when they go into the field to do observations or work with teachers, what they see is often counter to that. And so that's a real challenge that I face. And so I know when I've been to Helsinki and to Finland to view in schools to see how students from a very young age are exploring their natural world and finding problems that they want to solve, really, demonstrates what you say is the ethos of the, education system. So, yeah.
Yuri, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think this is it somehow feels that it's rather sort of a new era. We do have a new curriculum in primary level. It is a very sort of different than the older ones, and this 21st century skills type of ideas are very much sort of focused in that curriculum, and also it focuses a lot on trying to sort of it's not that focus. It's very much focused on group work and ways to support individual sort of differences how sort of it tries to provide sort of every different things for different pupils as well. So it kind of it's a very new thing, and a lot of teachers are they're just trying to get used to that idea. So that there's a kind of a cultural transformation going on right now, but it's definitely very in a sort of a theoretical sense. It's a very modern, also a modern way of thinking in a way. But I think one of the sort of key things which seem to be quite sort of important for teachers today in this new curriculum seem to be that for quite a long time the education was seen kind of a value as such. It's that so I think the idea was that it didn't need a lot of sort of outside different definitions of what needs to be taught at schools coming from outside schools or from different institutions in society. And now that there are different kind of new skills and competencies which are brought to schools, and I think there's something which it's a kind of a negotiation going on in schools right now. Or how do you see this, Anneli?
Yeah, I agree. And I think we need to give the teachers some time to really discover it. And maybe we haven't been so strong in giving like support at the implementation stage. But change takes place slowly. But we kind of brought the what we call transversal skills into subject learning. So while you're learning subjects and the contents, you're also learning skills. And this is really new for the teachers to be aware that while I'm teaching mathematics or biology, I'm also teaching certain skill areas. However, the world is moving so fast that when we kind of collaboratively created the national curriculum, that's a few years ago already, although we haven't used it a very long time, I see that there is a greater need right now for social emotional skills, which are partly, we have this skill area called taking care of oneself and others, and for example, so it comes very close. But there's a lack of empathy, there's a lack of kind of really collaboratively learn how to accept others as they are and so on, so I think we need to update our curriculum, more often than what we've done before.
So just to throw kind of the flip side of this, right? So we can obviously learn a lot about what the purpose of school is and the purpose of that we've talked about. But I'm just curious what you would say what the purpose of school is not, which I think is sort of interesting to think about in terms of and how that may vary. We had a group of a larger group of individuals.
Well, I think one of the purposes of school, or one of the, how did you frame it?
What the purpose is not.
Yeah, is I would say to attract students or to group them according to perceived ability or a limited understanding of ability, meaning that often in the US we track from a very early age and it's based on one type of test form instead of viewing kids as having multiple abilities and strengths. Mm-hmm. So I would say, yeah, that's one example.
I think I follow up with that, saying the first thing that came to my mind is that the purpose of school is not to test children. Assessment is part of learning, but really, that's what first comes to my mind.
Yuri, do you have?
That is definitely true, and we do have a little bit of sort of a difficult relation to these different kind of standardized tests in Finland. But another thing that comes to my mind is that I wouldn't like to see schools or any other educational institutions focus too much on just skills or sort of skills which are very sort of narrowly defined and which seem to be relevant at this point at today, but we're not sure whether they will be relevant tomorrow or in the future. So I think in that that's a sort of a debate which is going on. It seems to be going on in Europe as a whole. That what is the role and status of knowledge, theoretical knowledge and disciplinary based knowledge in all school levels. And I think it's a very sort of good reminder that that we constantly need to talk about what is the role of knowledge in different curricula today, so that we don't get too deep into different kind of skills. I think that's a very, it seems to be a very sort of important thing which is going on.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So it sort of leads to my next question, which is, there's obviously a very strong emphasis on not testing and not on sort of overall assessment in the Finnish system. But one of the things that is constantly being discussed is that Finnish, I think 15-year-olds are doing better than the OECD average on sort of the one international assessment exam, the Pisa. And I know Finland has slipped a bit in recent years, and there's been some discussion about that. But I wonder just if we could talk some about why you think Finnish students are so successful on this international assessment exam that measures, as far as I understand, mathematics and reading literacy. Is there, I think, a science component as well? So what your thoughts are, and I think that's something that I think a lot of people are trying to figure out, right? If there's something to figure out. So Nelly, would you like to start perhaps?
Number one is high quality teacher education. I really think that it really gives the teachers enough skills to be research-based. We bring them up, educating them to be research-based. They are able to analyze the learning situations themselves, and also have a lot of skills, pedagogical skills, to vary their pedagogy. I think we've always been very strong in supporting the weaker achievers. And we have, like Yuri mentioned, we have the smallest differences between schools in the world. And that also comes from the fact that we believe that one public system is good for all. And then the third factor, besides the teacher education and one public school system for all, is the high quality curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely agree. And I think, as a comparison, the culture of teacher education in the States, when you mentioned, Nelly, at the very beginning, sort of some of the strongholds, I think you could actually compare those to the reasons why either teachers leave the profession here, which we have a massive retention problem in the US. But the teachers don't leave the classroom because of the students. They leave because they feel like they're not respected. They feel like they're underprepared for the situation, and they feel like they have very, very little control and ability to relate with the curriculum. And so, as you mentioned, those things as sort of the strengths in your education program, I think that teachers in the U.S. would point to those as things they really struggle with on a day-to-day basis. Particularly this notion that teachers and the public education system is really valued in Finland, and that was something that I noticed over and over again in my visits to Finland. But that is something that we struggle with. There's a huge political backlash on schools of education, and they're under a lot of stress. And because of our frequent assessments, it sort of counters that, because then there's something you can always point to, because, if you're constantly assessing your students, there will be a measure that demonstrates somebody isn't doing well, right? And so, yeah, it really is interesting when you draw those comparisons. Yeah.
Yuri, do you want to add to this?
It seems that even for example, the primary school as an institution, it has lost some of its kind of aura, but for some reason it seems that even, or at least for those students who are entering teacher education, they somehow see schools as their future sort of teaching as a career. They seem that schools are relatively stable kind of environments, that they somehow feel that because when they were at school, they felt that schools are quite comfortable, and they enjoyed schooling, and they thought that it somehow felt that this is my place. I know what to do here. It's very safe and things like that. And that's something that they feel also when they come to teacher education, and they have a very strong passion that for example, when they come to the interviews, when they're trying to get in, they very much emphasize the idea that well, this is pretty much there are two basic narratives. The first one is that this is the only option that I have, that I've always wanted to become a teacher, and well, this is something that I really want to do. That if you don't let me in this time, I'll next year I'll be here again, and things like that. And the other narrative is that they want to emphasize that, well, this is I haven't always wanted to become teacher, but this is kind of my decision that I've done, kind of made that. So it seems quite sort of a stable environment, and also there's a kind of the socio-economical background of parents. It hasn't affected a lot to how their children are doing in school. So it's I think that's also quite sort of a reasonable kind of explanation also to the Pisa results.
I think it's really quite interesting, because everything that three of you said, it was all nothing about sort of the students themselves or sort of their backgrounds or anything, which is, I think, often kind of the response, but it's very much about the system, and it's about the value of education, profession, and the education that the teachers are getting, which I think is quite interesting. And we'll get later in the conversation to kind of how things can be transferable or portable from Finland, and I think this can kind of help us to sort of think about how we can take some of the what we can learn in that. Before we move get to some of my other questions, we actually have a couple of questions from one of our participants who's joining us virtually, and so I'll read the question, and whoever, Yuri actually might be good to start out with this, and whoever else may jump in. So the person says, with regards to teacher education, what supports are in place for new teachers, and once they enter the classroom? And then what expectations are set for continuing education on the part of teachers as well? So Yuri, do you want to start off?
If we start with that continuing education, that has been one of the biggest sort of issues, and actually there's a big project going on in Finland to support this. It has been quite of a difficult part for some reason, because it's a master's degree. There's kind of this idea that teachers are pretty much kind of educated as much as they need to be, and then the continuing education, it hasn't been that well supported. But I think now it becomes obvious that it is needed, definitely. And what we're trying to do right now in this particular project, we're trying to find different ways to combine kind of this sort of higher education and then this continuing education, and trying to develop different kind of models for that.
And then, Nelly, or if you want,
oh, please.
Just,
Yeah.
in terms of sort of as students are, go ahead.
In Finland, teachers are fully qualified once they graduate with their masters, whereas in some other countries you still have to kind of get a license to teach. So that's one difference that we have. But like Yuri was saying, it has been important to develop professional development programs, because Finnish teachers also have a lot of freedom. They are very autonomous. And the education provider needs to provide professional development opportunities for each teacher. But then it's often left too much, I would say, also upon the individual teacher. So some teachers are very eager to develop their skills through their career, whereas there are those who are not so keen on. Whereas we think that also new teachers at the induction phase need support. So some universities have offered mentoring programs where mentoring has been quite popular. So I think the new teachers, they can't learn everything at the university before they start working in the field. They often feel that they lack skills facing children with special needs, learning difficulties, dealing with parents, especially if the parents are difficult and demanding, and so that way the mentoring programs really can support. However, they are not every school has this mentoring system, but we hope that in the future that will happen. Another thing we've had during this past government term has been tutor teaching, and one teacher of a school spends maybe 1 day a week tutoring the others, not only on digital skills, but also on pedagogy. And so that way, we're trying to build learning communities within each school according to our national curriculum, so that each school would have a sort of like a structure to learn all the time from each individual person, and they would then also start collaborating with the neighbor school, learn from other schools, and building networks. So there are several approaches, but I think professional development itself for teachers needs to be developed further.
Go ahead.
Sure, yeah, and that's interesting because I think we have some of the same struggles where our mentor programs or our call them induction programs are often left up to the schools in which the students have a job. And so they're not systematic across the country by any means, and in many cases non-existent. And so I think that's a similar struggle and something that universities are looking into how to better support our students as they enter those first couple of years, because for us in the US, really that's where a lot of our retention problems are. So many students stop teaching after 2 to 3 years. So it's important for us to strengthen those programs.
Are there any other pause for a moment to see if there are questions from any of our participants online or here would like to jump in at this point? I have a question.
Yeah. So, kind of going back to the question of what education is for, I am putting on my historian's hat here and thinking back to talking about the historical development that Yuri was referring to, and thinking about schools have, sort of, especially in the 19th century and the late 19th century, were often sites of nation building, right? Creating cultural identity and a civic identity. And that still continues today. We learn American civics and you learn French history and French law, those kinds of things. But also in more, in interesting ways that you don't often think of, like thinking about my understanding of French schools have much more developed periods for lunch, and you sit down and you do multiple courses because you're learning how you eat as a French person. You talked about Spanish siestas. And so going from a kind of nation building, it can also be a way of helping to integrate newcomers into society as well, of building civic identity and cultural identity, however inclusive you make those, to help integrate immigrants into society. So I'm just curious, in the Finnish model, how does that work? I mean, there has been immigration into Finland. How have And you go back to 1850, I imagine that education was a part of kind of national identity building up to independence in the early 20th century. But how does the education system kind of serve that purpose, of maybe kind of establishing some of those cultural norms and helping to build them?
Who would like to jump in on that?
Or does it not?
Well, thanks very much. That was a very good question, very challenging one as well to I guess the Finnish educational system as a whole. I think the whole process of internalization, which is quite new phenomenon in Finland, and I think schools in general are kind of at this point they are struggling with that in a way that that there are many examples where principals and the whole school community it very much feels that that it's kind of learning new things about different cultures and how to cope with different languages and different levels of students and things like that. So it's definitely learning, but the problem might be that that perhaps the parents and the kind of a community it doesn't sort of understand the process, but it only kind of sees the problems or the issues which are naturally which sort of come up in schools. And so it's kind of the communities and the parents, they are kind of struggling with the idea that there are many sort of different cultures and there are different languages and their own child necessarily it's not clear anymore that it's kind of it will be a multicultural classroom, and it's quite new thing. So I think this is something that we are sort of very much in the learning phase.
I agree, and I think Finnish nation has been a very homogeneous population in the past, and we've had to learn to really learn from other countries how they've taken the immigrants into learning. In practice for us, that means that we have had these preparatory classes where children, once they enter the country, have the right to learn in, and they've spent a year there learning the language. Finnish language is not so easy to learn. However, now we look at more like an sort of integration inclusive approach for children of immigrant background. But of course, we emphasize local issues, but our children and young people are living in the global world. So I think in a way, it's easy to become kind of, or to support internationalization in a way. On the other hand, you might end up having like two different cultures or ways of living, struggling, understanding, so in our society we have, like during the past weeks, also have had a lot of discussion on these issues. And we hope that school can be a place where we can support families and children who enter the country and help them also achieve a good life here. It is an issue that we, like Yuri said, we need to learn from others. What comes to my mind is Canada, for example, how they, for years already, have had a very good system of kind of implementing learning for immigrant background children. We're not quite there yet.
That's
Certainly
true.
language is a good first step.
Yeah.
You can't speak Finnish, it's going to be harder to operate effectively, I think.
Can I just very briefly add one
Sure.
thing? That and also I think that many people, I don't think they have realized yet the potential that schools have in this sort of the whole process of internalization, and also kind of supporting different cultures to their community. So they seem to be, there's a huge amount of potential in schools where children and adolescents are doing things together. And it's a sort of the whole idea of inclusion is kind of it's very real in schools, and so it's kind of that's why schools are really the most important place where to do this kind of new kind of cultural work, and what can it kind of how does it reflect back those values to society? I think that's a very important thing.
So something that has come up in various comments is kind of the value of the teaching profession. And I know that in surveys asking individuals whether the teaching profession is valued in society, that Finland consistently ranks near the top. We rank near the bottom, with obviously the rest of Europe sort of in between. So to, just to get, some of your perspectives on sort of the value, obviously this keeps coming up, sort of the teaching profession is valued, and just to think about why that is. Why is it that being a teacher in Finland is a valued profession, seen as something very almost very special, that you're part of this program? Who would like to?
Well, I can start. We've been very lucky to choose the best out of best students to study education for the universities, and and very motivated young people. Yuri already mentioned in the earlier comments about how the students feel about teaching and why they want to enter. Often when I talk to teachers and I ask them this question, why did you become a teacher? They come up with kind of a couple of answers. One is that it's a very kind of autonomous and creative profession. I can make a lot of decisions, I can be creative, I can also grow as a human being as a teacher, So, and a lot of them also answer that they want to make this world a better place, and a teacher has a role in this. So these are some of the answers that I get from the teachers who are working in schools.
Yeah, I think in the US we struggle with, the push to privatize education. As you all mentioned, one of your strengths is that there's one public education for all, right? So you attend school in the city in Helsinki and you're going to receive the same high quality education in the rural area. And there really has been a push against that here, as our political system, some may say that, privatizing education and there should be no public education, right? And so I think that has demoralized a lot of our public school educators because it devalues their profession. Interestingly enough, I think those two things that you mentioned, autonomy and creativity, those are exactly what our public school educators say they have. Zero. I actually have one former student who's in her 5th year of teaching, and she emailed me last week to say, that she was actually putting the profession, and one of the reasons was she actually has no time to go to the bathroom because her day is that scheduled. And I think, but conversely, when you ask students why they want to become teachers or stay in education, it's very similar to what the Finnish teachers are saying. They want to make change in the world, and they see education as a way to do that. So I think there is a glimmer of hope in that we still value education in the U.S. Greatly, and so I'm hoping that could change. Yeah.
So I thought we have all sorts of questions that we're getting from participants online, but before we kind of get to those, I actually want to spend a little bit of time talking about the nature schools, which I know is something that's fairly unique in Finland, and to talk a bit about what they are and what we can sort of learn from them. So Kathy.
Yeah, so some of the forest schools from the very young age and just the amount of outdoor education that Finland students experience from a very young age all the way, through some of their secondary programs. I think the value on the nature in Finland is something that's really interesting. I'm a science educator, and I study environmental education. And here in the U.S., there's a concern about that disconnect and lack of time for our students to experience in nature. And I was just really taken aback by how much Finland, the Finland system, and probably the people place an importance on experiencing that education. And it almost seems as if it's infused throughout the curriculum. So in the US, maybe in secondary school, you could take an environmental science class if you were interested, or you may learn a little bit about the environment in terms of weather or the different features of the earth. But what seems different in Finland, and I'd be curious to hear about these, is that there really is an understanding that the environment is another classroom, and students should be out experiencing that classroom.
One of the transversal skills that we have embedded in all learning is a sustainable way of living. So it goes through the basic education. And and I'd like to also emphasize the fact that despite that we have a national curriculum, we also have a local curriculum. These are all co-created together, and we may also have a school-based curriculum. So schools can emphasize certain areas. If they want to have more music, or maybe have emphasize environmental issues or dance or whatever, they can have that. And so also the national curriculum gives flexibility in emphasizing certain areas, and like these schools that have decided to even emphasize more like sustainable way of living, or outdoor activities or forest learning, it is possible. So it's one of the, I think when we talk about curriculum, we have to look at in a 3-step kind of process, but also as a value to give freedom also to emphasize what they like.
Yeah, and that's really interesting.
Do you see that some of the practices can be, in these forest schools, can be,
Yeah, so I think that there have been good, this is one of the pieces that there have been good examples of replicating some of these studies. So, and it's sort of closely tied to some of the Montessori education that is often pointed to in preschool education here in the States. And so I think that there are opportunities. What I think we struggle with, which Nelly pointed to as a difference, is we tend to have either a national curriculum adopted by the states or a state curriculum, but what's absent is that local curriculum anymore. And so when you think about understanding environmental science, it is often very important to understand one's local environment, because then students begin to understand, why are these problems important, right? And so when you think about issues of climate change, or lack of, potable water, if in their area they don't witness those pieces, although it's becoming harder and harder not to witness climate change these days. but it's that there's that disconnect for students. And so by having that local curriculum infused on top of the national curriculum, I would imagine it provides a lot more autonomy for teachers to align those pieces together. Yeah.
So we have, as I said, many questions, and they keep coming. So we, which is good. We actually have quite a few teachers, I think, might be joining us on their breaks if they're able to. So I will read one of these questions to start us off. And Yuri, maybe you might want to. This might be good for you. So the person says another thread in the conversation has been related to how rapidly education is changing. I'm wondering how instructional technology integration is viewed in Finland, as well as issues of student privacy. So Yuri or anyone else may want to jump in on that.
Well, this has been a lot. There's been a lot of debate on the role of ICT and technology in schools, definitely. And just a couple of months ago, there was a study that sort of a very sort of it publicly kind of pointed out or wanted to point out that that there are some negative effects on using sort of too much ICT in classrooms. So I think that was there has been a lot of debate on that. But I think basically, at least this was situation a couple of years ago, the classroom, they are quite well equipped with technology. So it's something that teachers seem to be quite, on the other hand, they seem to be quite interested in trying to sort of integrate technology and different kind of platforms and different kind of environments, technological environments to the teaching, using blogs, for example, in classrooms and things like that. But then on the other hand, there are those who sort of very much see the danger in going too far with that and sort of highlighting or bringing technology as a sort of a major role in classrooms, and then by doing that, perhaps missing something which could be even more important. I think that kind of trying to find the balance there. Also, there's been a lot of discussion about equality issues relating to ICT. There's been during the past few years, there's been quite a lot of emphasis in this bring your own device type of ideology. Also, that schools are trying to encourage or support different platforms that would allow students or pupils to use their own mobile phones or handheld devices that they typically use at home as well. But this has become a little bit of a kind of an equality issue as well. The privacy thing is, well, this could be only my impression, but somehow I feel that it's only now it is becoming to sort of it's coming into under debate. There has been in EU, there's been a new legislation recently which has set new kind of rules to these privacy things also, and schools are also facing new legislation, and I think that has brought up some things which might not be very well sort of in very good shape in classrooms, but I think that's only just it's pretty much coming to. We're starting to talk about that.
All right. So another question that has been asked is, and Nelly, this may be good for you, is why do you think that privatization and the privatization bug, as they say, has hit Sweden so hard, but did not catch on as much in Finland?
Yes, often we follow after Sweden, but in this case, I think we're lucky that we didn't. And I think it automatically kind of divides the nation. And because more educated parents are more aware of the different possibilities than maybe parents of less education background in their background. So I think the free school system that Sweden has probably brought in that we have very similar societies has sort of given a possibility to have a choice. On the other hand, I think it takes something away of the thought of equity. So I don't see a need for us. I don't know why we should have private schools, in such. So it was a decision that they made, and I don't really know the background why, kind of at that time. But it's been a struggle for them also to train teachers, and because then you automatically start kind of maybe pay more for teachers in a private school, start, choosing the teachers in a different way. So, yeah, there are a lot of issues that I think it must have been important for them at that time. I don't know the background. I don't know, Yuri, if you know more about why they chose to build free schools.
No, I don't, unfortunately, but I somehow feel that it must be because of this kind of the idea that basically all political parties, they very much support the system as it is now, and there hasn't actually been a lot of kind of actual debate on changing the system radically. So I think that has been kind of it has kind of helped to also to maintain the system as it is. At times there has been some debate about a little bit of a sort of kind of a political transformation, and for example, there has been suggested to have more standardized tests, for example, and there has been some of those I don't know what to call them, but there have been a few publications, for example, which have tried to support the idea that the school system should be sort of opened up a little bit, but that hasn't received a lot of sort of political support, and I think that's why it has maintained pretty much the same.
So, Cassie, this may be for you. So, I'll read this question from someone joining us online. They say, I'm a new teacher in the U.S. just getting my certification. Our required classroom practices are not developmentally appropriate or humane. For instance, we teach reading at age 5 before human brains are generally ready for the skill set involved in reading. How can we apply what we learned from the Finnish model without losing our jobs? Personally,
this person is exactly right. As a mom of 2 boys who are now 12 and 14, I can say from my own experience was just this, which was just in the 2-year difference. My older son, there seemed to be not as much push at age 5 for reading, and so about age 7.5, I remember finding him up in his bunk bed one day, literally like reading a book and thinking, oh, he's finally figured out how to learn to read, right? And it wasn't that simple, of course, but there wasn't that same level of pressure. And then my younger son was actually required to go in prior to school to take a reading assessment, to which he walked in and said, I don't know how to read, and walked promptly out. And so, kind of shows those differences. And he was immediately placed on a program to say, he was a struggling reader. He needed time out of classroom to focus on this. And from those, just those examples was just a difference in confidence in terms of reading. And now, at 12 and 14, they both read on grade level. But interestingly enough, my older son loves to read a lot more. My younger son, it's still something that, every night we have to sort of, punch the clock, 20 minutes of reading, those sorts of things. And so, I don't really know, other than I do think what I've found in similar ways, and I speak to secondary teachers a lot about this in terms of science practices. There's a lot you can do behind the closed door. And so the way that you approach assessments or labeling students, I think, is still within a lot of the locus of controls of students. So I talk a lot of my students about this and say, why are the honors classes and AP classes historically segregated by race? You can, help to change that by, advocating for those students of color to be in those different classes. And I think the same can be, in this pre-service teacher's classroom, in that how you, focus on those reading skills at such a young level. There are, unfortunately, a lot of benchmark assessments which will be difficult to get around, but really focusing on, helping those students understand that they are all succeeding, they all have multiple abilities and strengths, is important. And also talking to the parents about that. I think parents are, we worry about our children if they're labeled as, a struggling reader at age 5, right? What does this mean for the rest of their life? And so those panics, I really do hope that this is one of those pendulums that will swing again, because I think it has huge detrimental effects on children's self-esteem and confidence, which we know is really linked to their achievement in schools. So, yeah.
So
good luck.
Yeah. So I think this is a nice segue to kind of have maybe a final kind of discussion, which is, more generally, what can we in the U.S. and just more generally educators as well as policymakers outside of Finland, learn from the Finnish model? How can we incorporate sort of the processes, the approach, the method, and respond to this kind of comment that, as I was preparing, for today and reading up on a lot of the conversations and about this, what I kept coming up was, Finland is just too different. Different in, talk about what different means, but that we can't, or the U.S. is too different from Finland, or fill in the blank is just too different. How do you all respond to that, and what kinds of things can we see that can be, sort of translated and can be, and that we can learn from what Finland has done. So, Nelly, would you like to start?
When we got the first PISA results around year 2000, especially the Asian countries asked us, well, how can we copy this? And I always have replied, you cannot copy the Finnish system, because it's connected with the history, the past, the culture, the values, and so on. But you can learn from it, and we can learn from other countries' education system. So what I think is so important is that each country will keep moving, keep developing all the time, and not expect change to happen from up to bottom in a hierarchical way, but rather what we're trying to discover right now is to have sort of like a bottom-up approach, so that we listen to the students, we listen to the families, we listen to people in the society, we listen to the teachers. What are the biggest challenges that they face at the moment? And then start collaboratively co-creating maybe problem-solving solutions for that. And then we try to experiment certain things, and then we find out what seems to work and what doesn't work. And what seems to be working, we bring that knowledge to the political decision makers, so that we kind of switch around the hierarchical way of making decisions concerning education. So this is something that we are practicing now at the government level, and also at the municipal education providers level with 12 municipalities. It's not easy for us, but wherever each country is, there are tons of possibilities really to start developing. I've always said that we also have to keep moving all the time. We have to see, we're concerned about boys' literacy skills at the moment. We are concerned about the social emotional skills. We're concerned about well-being of children and the teachers. We're concerned about leadership skills of principals. So there are issues that we see, and we kind of have to start solving those problems together. And then kind of course, government policy, the local policy, and sort of like the kind of the structure keeps you gives you possibilities to do, but development work needs to be done at all levels of the system. We talk about the change in the ecosystem, which means that wherever the problem arises, it should be solved there with the help of the other members of the ecosystem. So this is something new thinking, some kind of a new thinking that we're trying to build, but to build learning communities at all levels of the system is also very important. So I think we all have our challenges. We're not perfect, but we can really collaborate and learn from each other globally.
That's a very positive assessment. I appreciate. Yuri, do you want to jump in?
No, well, nothing much to add to that. That was a very that was a great answer. The thing that I was just wondering is that it seems also when we have been working with our international partners in higher education, it's there's always the same question that what we actually, that they often say that in the beginning, usually they say that what we'd like to have is the Finnish sort of model of doing things, and then we start to sort of start talking and sort of negotiating and talking about different sort of cultural backgrounds, and end up to sort of in a situation where we sort of also find out together that many things in classrooms are doing pretty much in the same way. So it has to be something that happens sort of around that, whatever that sort of cultural environment means. But I guess what we are trying to do here in Finland as well, we're sort of thinking of what does, for example, engagement, what does it mean today when the role of institutions as a whole is changing, and the kind of the whole point of education is a little bit changing, and there are no sort of different traditional structures anymore, but there are the new kind of sort of players in the field, in a field of education as well, and what we are trying to think is that how can we engage the communities, for example, to be part of the schooling and education, and I think that has brought up quite sort of interesting things. It's also, it points out the kind of the old ways of doing things, or these not so good habits perhaps that we have in all school levels, but I guess that's something that we are also kind of trying to figure out of what these things in communities and community partnerships, what do they mean?
So Cassie, hearing all of these things, how do you see these kinds of things and others being incorporated into the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, I think Yuri and Nelly are exactly right in that I've been in many schools across the U.S. and seen, very similar practices to what they're talking about. So it's not that we don't have the ability to do these things. We do struggle with some major issues here in terms of our teacher education model, in both retention and recruitment. And so I think those are where a lot of our efforts need to rely. And when you sort of look politically, there are some changes happening in terms of on the ground, as Nelly pointed to, which with the teacher strikes beginning in West Virginia and now currently right now in Los Angeles, second largest school district in the United States. And I think it's actually about this the school district is about the size of Finland's public education system. So, if they could make some significant changes, it would, have massive impacts, right? And so I think some of that will happen, right, as teachers are recognizing their collective political power here. I'm hopeful that things will change.
Well, that's a positive note, I think, to wrap up the conversation. I think that a lot of the things that you all mentioned about in terms of the kinds of things that that can be portable or translate, right? We're never going to see a wholesale change of the U.S. system or any other system or a copying, as Nelly sort of mentioned. But I think that sort of best practices in creating kind of these learning communities and sort of bottom-up models and engaging the community. I'm obviously not in education, but to me that seems like all sorts of things that that can be incorporated into different systems where changing the culture and the history of a country may be a little more challenging, and the entire system. But I think that there are some positive things that we can learn from as well. So with that, if I don't know if you have any concluding thoughts, any of you. But I really enjoyed the conversation, and I think our participants have as well, and obviously lots of interest by those joining us virtually. So I don't know if there are any concluding comments.
No, thank you. I learned a lot from both of you, so appreciate the conversation.
It's been a pleasure. I think working in education is a privilege because you're also working for the future and for the future of each child. In Finland, living in a small country, we cannot lose anyone, and we need to work hard to make sure that everyone will have the same equal chances to build a good life. That's not always self-clear, or we need to support the families also at these times with their struggle to bring up their children.
Yuri, any final thoughts or?
Just thanks very much for this discussion. That this was really a pleasure.
Well, thank you, and thank you to all three of you for joining us, and for the two of you too sticking around. I know it's now later in the evening, so I appreciate that very much. So thanks to everyone.